Hello and welcome. My name is Hannah and I do all sorts of crafts, and today we're going to be focusing on knitting. So if you've watched any of my videos in the past, you probably know that I tend to focus on sewing projects, but just with busyness and how life has been recently, I haven't had a lot of time to sew. And I find that a lot of times if I don't have a lot of free time, I just don't sew. I tend to want to get a project done in a specific period of time, because if I walk away from my sewing and don't work on it for 2 weeks, when I come back, I have no idea what I was doing. I don't know what all these random pieces are. I don't know what step I left off on. I'm just kind of lost. So unless I have a few days in a row where I know, okay, I can work on this very consistently and get it done and have a really good idea of what I'm working on, I just don't sew. So recently I've really been focusing on knitting just as a craft, because it's really easy to sit down and not touch for 2 to 3 weeks or months or maybe years, and you can still come back to it and you can pretty much pick up where you left off, because your yarn is there and you just pick it and you go and you knit. And you can sit there for 20 minutes and knit. You can sit there for 2 hours and knit. It's just a really easy project to pick up and go. So recently, being busy and not having a ton of free time to sew, which you might be able to tell from the fact I haven't posted a video in a while, I have been knitting more. So I thought, why don't I post a video about my knitting? I posted a couple shorts about some sweaters I finished up recently, and I would say by far the most common comment that I get is about what pattern I use. And I usually reply to these and say I don't really use patterns. And the same goes for sewing. If you watched any of my videos, you know I don't really use patterns. They're really difficult to understand, in my opinion, and are frustrating then if they don't fit right, because you spend so much time trying to get it perfectly to match the pattern, and then if it doesn't fit right, you've wasted your time. Very frustrating. So knitting, like sewing, I tend to just kind of draft my own patterns, and I don't have a specific follow these numbers in this specific guide, but I did want to give kind of a tutorial of my process and how I go about drafting my own patterns, so that if you would be interested in knitting your own sweater without having to follow a really complicated pattern, especially if you're just wanting kind of a simple sweater, I promise it's probably not as hard as you think to come up with your own pattern. Today I'm going to be focusing on specifically a drop shoulder style sweater. So this isn't really a tutorial for raglan, because I don't really like raglan sweaters. So if that's not what you're looking for, if you're looking for a raglan tutorial, this probably is not very helpful. I tend to enjoy what is called a drop shoulder sweater. So I didn't make the sweater that I'm wearing, but it is a drop shoulder where the shoulder of your sweater hits midway down your arm kind of, so it doesn't actually hit your shoulder. I really enjoy this type of sweater because it's moderately oversized and just has that coziness factor that is a necessity out of a sweater, in my opinion. I just have to have a cozy, comfy sweater, and that's why I lean towards oversized sweaters, and drop shoulder almost always end up being kind of an oversized fit anyways, and so that just really works for me. I also love drop shoulder because I do feel like they hold up better over time. I tend to find that things that are knitted all in one piece tend to also stretch all in one piece. But when you have actual seams that have been sewed up, those really can't stretch. I know a lot of knitters don't enjoy seaming garments, but I've been sewing a lot longer than I've been knitting, and so it just really doesn't bother me. I like seaming them because it makes me feel like I have a little bit more control over how it fits. If you have a knit that you're doing that's a single piece knit and you mess up the fit of it, you can't unpick the seam and just adjust it a little bit. There's nothing there to fix. So I like that seams kind of allow for a little bit of flexibility, which I have needed sometimes. I've got 3 different projects that are currently started that are my works in progress that I'm gonna be trying to get finished up by the end of this video, so I can show you my process and then also how that kind of ends up at the end result, and mistakes that I've made that I can maybe hopefully help you avoid. So I feel the need to cut in here just to tell you that I'm not going to get these projects done. I don't want you to be excited about seeing the finished product of all these, because I just took on more than I could. So that's my disclaimer. So the first one I have, I've been working on the longest here. It's like a super lightweight cotton, and I was just making a solid, but it's all the same yarn, green, like little t-shirt. And I am most of the way done. Let's see if I can hold this up so you can kind of see. So there's the bottom of it. Like I said, I like to do bottom up, and then this will eventually become the collar. It's a little bit of a mess. I've got the back done and I'm working on finishing up the front. Okay, so this green one, I started this in the beginning of July. So it's been a couple months, but as you'll see, I've been working on a couple other things, so it's kind of been put on the back burner a couple times. Like I said, it's 100% cotton, and sometimes I find that after I've been working with cotton for a while, it like kind of starts to wear on your fingers because it's just a little bit rougher than other yarns. But I've got to finish up the neckline of it, add like a collar, and add sleeves. The next one that I have here, I started in the beginning of September, and I am quite a ways into this one. It's a few pieces here, I gotta show you. Okay, so I have the body completely done, minus the collar. I just need to cast that off, but it's like a specific stitch I have to do. I just haven't gotten around to doing it, but it's a super pretty, like neon-y yarn that this was kind of one of my first like striping, like uniform striping sweaters, and I'm really excited about it. And then for the sleeves, I went ahead and started it because sometimes putting the sleeves or doing the sleeves feels like a new cast on. So sometimes it's a way to make you feel like I'm starting a new project. But I have this sleeve done to this amount, and then I'm trying like a little designy thing where the sleeve stripes are twice the width of the body stripes. So we'll see how that goes, but that's the second project. And then this last example I have of my work in progress sweaters, I started last night. Not even for the video, I just had this idea in my mind and I was so excited about it that I was like, I have to. I'm doing brioche stitch for the first time, and I was like, last night I was like, I'll just learn how to do it. Like I'll do a swatch on like some like other unimportant yarn that I have, and I'll learn how to do brioche, and I figured it out, and I was like, I have to see what it looks like on this yarn, so I'll just do my swatch. And then I did my swatch and I was like, I have to have a sweater out of this, and so I started a sweater last night. So this one I'm not very far in at all. Oh gosh, I'm gonna tangle my yarn, but this is what I have so far. It's kind of hard to see, but that's actually gonna be the wrong side. This is gonna end up being the right side. It's so pretty and green. I don't know how well you can tell. This is actually like 5 different strands. So for the dark green here, I'll just show you the yarn I've got in my lap. For the dark green, I've got, this is a fingering weight merino that I actually dyed myself, and I've had for a few months now, and I've just been itching to use. I love this color so much. It makes me think of like bright green grass in the spring when it first like grows and it's all like little baby strands of grass. Like it just makes me so happy. And then I've got a mohair silk blend that I'm mixing it with because how could those not match better? I bought this like as a one-off at the Fiber Festival I went to in May. And then when I was like going through my yarn stash recently, I was like, these match so perfectly. I might run out of this one. I've never done brioche before, so I don't know how much it's going to use. If I do, though, I already looked, and the company I bought it from, Dye Mad Yarns, still carries it, so I could buy a skein online if I needed. So that's the green, the darker green strand. The lighter green, I have a fuzz in my, this is really fuzzy, this is a, like a sock yarn, so it's like a merino nylon. It's really light, so I actually have paired it also with, this is basically a piece of thread. It's so thin. I don't know if you can tell how thin it is, but it's got to be like lace weight. It was like in a grab bag of yarn at thrift store, so I have no idea what it is or where it came from. It's really soft. I feel like it's probably a natural fiber, but I have those paired together with some undyed Surrey alpaca. Oh my gosh, look how fluffy that is. That's why I had fluff in my mouth, but it's so soft. But I just got this at a wool festival that I went to like 2 weeks ago. So those are my 5 strands. I'm really excited about this one, and I'm excited that they're all kind of in different stages so I can kind of show you my process as we go forward in it. But let's first start with the basic plan of your garment. So the reason that I started sewing or started knitting these drop shoulder type sweaters is because I think of my background in sewing. Like, I don't know, it's just me. I don't know. I like the look of them, but it reminds me a lot of kind of the same process that I have to go through when I'm sewing. So essentially what I do is, because this is a seamed garment, it's got, and I'm going to put a drawing up here, these like main essential parts. You've got two like thinner, longer rectangular pieces. Those are your sleeves. And then you've got two larger squarish pieces with necklines for the front and the back. That's it. Like, that's the whole sweater. And that's, I think, what makes it so like doable. When you see that, it's like, that's all I have to knit. Those are really simple shapes, and keeping them as rectangular as possible makes it like actually very understandable, in my opinion. Knitting is usually pretty easy to do when you can keep things like squares and rectangles, because that's just what naturally comes out of your needles. Obviously, these shapes can be totally different depending on what type of sweater you want to do, and I'm going to get into like variations a little bit later, just because I want to kind of explain the basics before I get to that. The first thing that you're going to have to do, and don't like come at me for saying this, I know this is so unpopular, but you have to knit a swatch. I know they're so tedious. I know that they're not fun, but you have to. That's like a essential part of the process within, I mean, at least how I work, how my process works. If you don't knit a swatch, it's just guesswork. And I think that's most commonly when I like hear people talk about like, oh, I made a sweater and it was 3 sizes too big. It's because they just kind of guessed at how big it looked on their needles when they cast on and just went from there. I don't want to waste that amount of time. I don't want anyone else to waste that amount of time. I promise it's going to take you less time to knit a tiny little swatch and do the math than it is to knit a whole sweater, get excited, try it on, and find that it fits awful. So I'm going to show you, we're going to knit a swatch together. I'm going to do one. So I'm going to work on knitting a swatch so that I can show you in real time the math that I use to kind of calculate how big to make my sweater or how much to cast on when you actually start your project. While I do that, I do have a couple tips kind of going forward. If you are a beginner, if you're someone that's just looking for like a simple sweater pattern, I would say for sure a couple things to start with is pick a medium weight yarn. I wouldn't recommend one of the very bulky yarns that requires you use like a size 15 needle that's like super hard to even hold on to. I wouldn't recommend using a super tiny like fingering weight yarn, because it's gonna feel like it takes forever. You'll knit for 2 hours and have 2 inches. So I would pick like a medium weight yarn. It'll be really comfy. It'll be like a very comfortable thing to wear in your day-to-day, but it'll also feel like it builds up faster than a million hours. So while I knit this swatch, I also want to talk about swatching, because I don't really follow the rules with that either. I know that you're supposed to do a 4x4 square that has like almost like ribbed edging. There's like a name for it, but you're doing like a contrast stitch on the edge so that it doesn't curl. You're supposed to cast it off, wash it, wet block it, let it dry, then measure it. I do not do all that. Because I will forever be like the thriftiest person, I cannot waste that swatch of yarn. I cannot have a million swatches sitting around to just like exist and not do anything. And so I do not do that. I just make estimations on a dry swatch, and then I take it apart and I use it, because I just cannot waste yarn. Even if it's like the cheapest, crappiest yarn I've ever used, I don't want to waste it. So I'll tell you right off the bat, I'm not going to do that. If you feel like you have no idea how that yarn is going to react to water, which I have in the past, it can be helpful. Even if you do want to reuse that yarn, if you steam block it, it'll give you a good idea of what it might look like. Or even just put your live stitches on a piece of waste yarn, wash, block, measure, and then you can still take it apart. I don't do that. I feel like I've knit enough stuff that I can usually tell, depending on the yarn, what it's going to do when I wash it. And a lot of it has to do with how you lay it out after you wash it and how you allow it to dry. So that's a big part of it as well. I'm going to finish knitting this, and then I'm going to show you my measuring process and the math that I plug into it. Okay, so I've knit a very small swatch. Usually I would knit At least I would recommend knitting at least a few inches across so that you can get a couple measurements. But just for the sake of showing you how I do this, I've done a very small swatch, and we're gonna kind of flatten it out here. All that I'm gonna do, and I recommend one of these like hard like measuring types. If you have anything that's like not a floppy ruler, would be helpful. Not necessary, just helpful. What I do is make sure that your knitting is laying out in a way that you can tell it's not stretched or anything. I recommend circular knitting needles because it can really relax on this like cord portion. And lay it out. You can usually tell if it's like stretched in any area. And then you will get your ruler here and find where one of these little V's starts, and then you're going to put the edge of the 1 inch on the left side here of the V, and then you count how many V's go across to complete the inch. For this swatch that I've done here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe a little bit extra, kind of ends at a weird point. So for situations like this, where I feel like you can't make a solid call on how many stitches wide it is, and this is why I usually do it probably almost twice this width, because I like to measure a couple times, I'll scoot it down and see how many stitches are in 2 inches to see if I can get like a more accurate reading from that. So if we start all the way from over here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and that actually looks like it ends accurately at 2, so maybe it is about 6 inches per stitch. I would say it kind of depends on the yarn. This one that I swatched with is cotton, so it will kind of stretch quite a bit over time, especially if you wash it. It'll like loosen up a lot. I will usually find the inch amount, or I'm sorry, the stitch amount per inch. So I'm gonna just, for the sake of example here, say that we're just gonna say that there are 6 per inch. It's like a little bit over that, but we're gonna say there's 6 per inch. I'm gonna use this sweater as an example. I actually just used this last night when I was measuring out for that green sweater that I just started. And all you're gonna do, I knew that I wanted the sweater of my sweater that I just started to fit like the body of this one. And I measured all the way across here. I know that it's 20 inches because I just did it last night. And I multiplied, in our example, it would be 6 times 20. That's how many stitches then you need across the front. If you want to start in the round and go up to the armhole, which is what I do a lot of times as well, you would just multiply that number by 2. Then you cast that many on, and you're starting your body from the bottom up. So I've already cast on all the sweaters that I'm using as an example in this video, but I wanted to kind of show this one and explain what I did. So this one's very similar measurements to the example that I'm using. When I did my swatch, stretched it a little bit because I know that this is like a superwash wool, and I know it's gonna stretch to some extent when I actually wash it. But I did 7 stitches per inch. It'll probably fit a little bit more like that once it's washed, but I did 7 stitches per inch, and I multiplied that by how many I wanted around, which ended up being 280. And then I additionally measured from the base of the sweater and then all the way up to how long I wanted it to be, which is going to be dictated by where your like armhole is. And then I knitted that far up. Once you get to that armhole portion, I'm just showing you the back shape of this one right now. Essentially what you'll do, you want to cast off a few stitches. I usually don't do too many. It's kind of hard to see on this because it's such a light fabric, but you want to create a little bit of width underneath your arm. It just gives you some extra mobility. So for this one, sorry, my needles are jangling around. For this one, I think it looks like about 6 stitches. So I cast off those 6 stitches, and then I like to go up the back first. So that's why this back half is finished. And you'll see for this, I'm just emulating that same shape that I had in my sketch, where it's a really shallow neckline. because you want the back half to go up higher so that it fits really comfortably. And all I do for this is really similar to how I start this project, where I have a sweater that I know I like how it fits. I measure across the back about how wide it is at the base, and then I compare that to my swatch measurement and how many stitches I have on my needles. I cast all these off, on mine at least. I cast this whole section right here off at once. Once you cast off, your yarn is only going to be on one side. So you'll have to work up one side at a time. Once you finish the one side, you'll go back over the other one. So I started on this one, I cast off all the way to this edge, knit all the way across. Now you want to start decreasing some so you get this slight kind of U or like sloped shape. What I do and what I think works pretty well, no matter what your yarn is decrease about 1 per row. If you don't feel like that would work right for your yarn or your gauge, try it out ahead of time, maybe on like a test piece, and see what the slope looks like. But generally you want kind of this smooth area right here. Once I get past the initial back section, I usually get this to the width that it's going to be sitting on top of my shoulder, and then I'll just leave them on my needles, which is why I like using round needles, or I'm sorry, circular needles a lot. And then I'll go over to the other side, do the exact same thing so that you have this like matching slope on either side, so that you have a nice even neckline. And then I will go back to the front. I'll pick up all those stitches again. Well, they're still on my needle, so I won't need to pick them up, but I start from where I left off under the armpit and go all the way back up to the top. And again, you want to measure on an existing sweater how much depth your neckline has to it, so that when you're looking at this, you can know how far down that you're going to stop. So my front section, my needles aren't long enough, so it's kind of hard to tell. My front section is about that much deeper. So I cast off the exact same way, you're just making it a larger section this time. And I don't know how well you can even see this because, again, it's a really light yarn. But right here, this is a flat section that I cast off again. I measured a sweater that I already have, that there's about this much width to the very bottom of the neckline. And then you do the same thing. Now the front is a little bit more drastic of a slope because it's just a wider opening as it is. So usually the first couple rows, I'm casting off 2 per row, and then going up from there. Once you get past that like really tight corner right there, you do the 1 stitch per row. Now this one, obviously I'm still working on quite a bit. So I have finished this side here, and I'm ready to stitch them together. This is what I have found to be, again, the easiest way to do this is basically you need to keep track of how many stitches you have at that shoulder, like kind of the peak of your shoulder in the back, and then match that in the front. And what I'll do is called a Kitchener stitch to stitch them together. And I can show you on this sweater because I've actually already done it. So I did the exact same shape. I can kind of show you here on the back where I cast off 1 big flat portion. I decreased a couple stitches along the edges to get that like slight sloping shape. I left my stitches live on my needles. I came back to the front. I picked up from the armpit, went all the way up to the top. Again, you can kind of tell in this one probably a little bit easier. There's a sort of flat section right here. That's what you'll cast off across. And then you'll just do about 1 per row. This one probably looks a little weird because it's like cinched on my needles quite a bit, but you're just wanting that gentle sloping shape until you get to the width of your neckline, which again, I would recommend measuring a sweater that you already have. I know I keep going back to that, but I just think it is the best way to get an idea of what is going to fit you well if you measure what you already have that fits well. But you'll get to that width, and you'll need to make these stitches match the number of stitches you have in the back. And then once you meet those, they're both live on your needles, and you're going to Kitchener stitch them together. It's supposed to be like seamless. You can probably tell because my stripes didn't match up correctly. So I've got green against yellow. So I really don't think it's terribly noticeable, but it's like pretty much the most seamless seam that you can do because it ends up just looking like knit stitches. Some of these are laying a little funny, but like especially over here, they look very seamless together. So that's why I like that a lot. And it's a pretty easy pattern to follow. So I feel like that was rather confusing. Again, just remember this is 4 pieces of fabric. The neckline really takes practice, and it's important to know what you want before you get there so that you can stop or decrease stitches when you need to. It's important to always measure twice, knit once, so that you don't have to go back and undo and redo, or it's a sweater you never wear because you don't like it. So I actually kind of changed my mind on this shoulder of my cotton tee because cotton tends to stretch quite a bit, and that Kitchener stitch has a lot of stretch like knit fabric does. So please ignore my lack of crochet skills, but instead of doing the Kitchener stitch, there's probably a name for this type of seam, I just don't really crochet that much. All I did was I took a crochet hook that was, I think this is the same size as my needles, but if you have smaller, that would probably be even easier. But I held my needles together and went through the first stitch in the back, the first stitch in the front, and then pulled yarn through both of them together, and then just repeated that the whole way down for this result. And I think this type of seam is a perfect alternative because it has really no stretch to it, which can add a lot of structure to the shoulder of your garment, which is kind of more likely to stretch anyways. I do feel like sometimes when I explain things, they're more confusing than when I just do them. So I hope that my explanation has not been just incredibly confusing. If it is, please comment if you have questions or would like me to re-explain something in a different way, because I know that it's complicated because I'm basically trying to explain a pattern, but in the way that I do it, it's not. It's just things I remember in my head, kind of rules for how to shape things. I really wanted to make this video as a way to encourage people to kind of challenge themselves to making sweaters without a pattern, because I find that it's one of the things that has made me so much of a stronger knitter, because it's hard, it's very difficult, especially the first time that you do it, because you are going to make a lot of mistakes. It's just kind of how it is. There's going to be a learning curve. And hopefully that's why I kind of recommend at least using a medium weight yarn, because if you use a really lightweight yarn, it's going to take you forever, and then you may not even like it, especially the first time. This is just how my brain works though. If this makes 0 sense and makes it more confusing, I'm sorry. I want it to be helpful. One thing that I will say, if you are wanting to kind of get into making your own patterns and maybe want to be a little bit more organized and I guess thoughtful about it, other than just I think this is gonna work, because usually that's what my own creative style is, more just I'm ready to jump into a project even if I don't really know what I'm doing, just because it's really fun to try new things and have new projects, and I love kind of expanding what I already know. But one great way of doing that and also being more organized is one of my favorite books. I don't own this book. I've had it on borrow from the library for the last 6 months. I've had to recheck it out twice now. It's called Vogue Knitting, and oh my gosh, this thing is a workhorse of a book. If you don't own any knitting book, I recommend owning this book right here. It has an entire section. It's actually the biggest section in the book on designing sweaters. Huge section. And it has been incredibly helpful because I don't know how to explain this, but as much as you try to do research online or just trial and error and trying new techniques, you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes you have to kind of reach outside of what you already know exists, or what you know that you can modify with things like this that are totally out of your comfort zone, where you're reading about tactics you've never heard of, because if you didn't know those existed, you could never research to see, how do I do this? I knew the Kitchener stitch existed because I'd seen people online posting videos of how, it's a seamless seam. And that's the only reason I ever even knew to look up a how-to of how to do the Kitchener stitch. So if you don't know new tactics that you can even try, how could you ever learn them, is kind of what I'm trying to say. So they've got a massive section on designing sweaters in a much more meticulous way than I do. So if you feel that this tutorial has been a mess and you are more confused, I'm very sorry. I'm really trying to be helpful, I promise. But if I've made it more confusing, this book is like an amazing guide, It even just teaches like really basic things from how to knit and decrease and increase and even things like that. There were certain kinds of decreases that I had never heard of that are supposed to be like more, not invisible, but they look better like worked into your work, and just simple things like that, that again, if you didn't know they exist, you would never know to look up to see like how to do this. So having, even if it's not this book, some sort of like encyclopedia of like knitting tactics and stitches and things like that is such a great resource, and I highly recommend it. It has been very helpful to me. I'm kind of just trying to give you what I know in my process, because that's really all I can give you, because I do not have the ability mentally to write a pattern. Oh my gosh, that just, I can barely read them. I've thought about before, like, what if I wrote a pattern for this? And just trying to think of like how I would word it makes my mind hurt. I don't know, I'm a very visual, like hands-on person. So trying to like read something and translate it to like, what does that look like actually doing? It's tough for me. It just doesn't make sense. Once you got the body of your sweater built, you need to move on to the sleeves. So I'm referencing the same sweater again that I've already measured previously, and I'm going to be measuring across just like I did with the body to get the width of the sleeves on this sweater. And this one I am going to be modifying a little bit. You can see that the sleeve kind of balloons out at the bottom and gets narrow again. Really all I want is just a gradual slope going up to my shoulder. And so I'm going to do a couple measurements on this sleeve. My shoulder is going to end up wider than what this is, so I'm going to measure in the middle and add about 1 inch to it for the total width at the end. So for my striped sweater, I started at the cuff and went up because I wanted to make sure my pink stripe was at the very end. And so for this one, I am going to have to attach it to the shoulder. I've gotten it to the length that I want it to, and I'm going to show you how I attach these together. So the process for this would normally be a lot easier. I had to use double pointed needles because I just didn't have the right size and round needles. And so I'm putting it on some waste yarn right now, just so that it'll be flexible so that I can stitch it together to the body a little bit easier. So for this part of the process, you have to follow sewing rules where you have right sides facing together. So I don't know why, but I couldn't think of any better way to do this. So I had to stuff the entire body of the sweater inside of the sleeve to get it to actually be right sides facing, and the sleeve would flip outside the correct way. And then once I got to that point, I pulled out these clips that I have from the Dollar Tree, and I just went around and clipped the portions together that I wanted to match up, mainly the armpit area and the bottom side of my sleeve where I had changed colors the whole way down, so that I knew that those were the most hidden, and then just also to kind of hold it together as I work. So I'm not going to pretend like this process was not so tedious. It took me forever. Basically, I had my live stitches in the back on the waste yarn there, and I picked up a stitch from my finished body and knitted it together with my live stitch. And then when I had 2 stitches, I cast the one off of the other until I was completely done. And here I am flipping it inside out to show you. Oh my goodness, look how nice that seam looks. I'm so pleased with it. It was super tedious, but I just think it looks so good and clean. Now, I'm going to be honest and say this is just about the furthest that I got with this project. I am loving how it is fitting. It is exactly what I had in mind. And then this is how far I've gotten on the second sleeve. The other way that I like to attach sleeves, and actually this is how I do it most often, is by picking up stitches. I will almost always do this method. The only reason I didn't for my striped sweater is because I wanted to make sure my stripes ended on pink, and I was a little worried about measuring that out and making sure it actually landed on the right stripe. But usually I do this method. So I'm going to show you how I do this on my cotton top that I've been making. So I've got the finished shoulder up here at the top, And I actually like to start in the armpit because then you're less likely to notice if there's like an imperfection. So I'm gonna transition down to this bottom part here that's kind of this flat section that again would end up going in your armpit. And I'm gonna show you how I pick up stitches. I'm sure there's a million different techniques, but this is what I have found works the best. So what you'll do, I'm just gonna start here in the middle. Now, if you look at each knitting row, they are kind of little V's, but I find that can be really confusing when you're picking up stitches because they kind of all look like V's in a way. So what I do is I look for that last row that you did. We're not gonna focus on this cast off row. We're looking at the actual last final like row. But if I can stretch it out for a moment to kind of show you, you'll notice that every row, each stitch goes in this kind of like squiggly pattern. So if we're looking at this row here, you've got a loop squiggle down, squiggle up, down, it goes back up, then down, then up, then down. I don't know if you can kind of see and like follow along with that pattern, but all those squiggle up areas is going to be that loop, that last loop that you had, the last stitch that you had. And then the squiggle down is kind of that area in between. And then it goes back up. It goes back down. It's like this weird little squiggly guy that just repeats over and over and over again. So the way that I keep these apart when I'm picking up stitches here is I look for all those squiggle ups. Just to be clear, this is the technical terminology. It's a squiggle up. So where I'm gonna start is like right in the middle here. I always use a crochet hook because I think it makes it so much easier to actually be able to grab the yarn and pull it through, especially because I use mostly metal needles, which yarn slides off of really easily, especially fingering weight. So I've got my set of needles here that I'm going to pick up stitches and put on, but I'm going to start with my crochet hook, and I'm starting here in the middle of the armpit area. And I'm going to start right here. If you can see, there's a little loop up right there, and I'm going to go right in there. And if you crochet at all, this is going to be probably a very simple process for you. And this looks really confusing, but when you get the hang of it, you just like can go. So you'll pick up your yarn from the back here. You want to make sure you're pulling your stitches through so that they end up on your right side, because that's going to hide your seam in the inside. And I always pull it through extra, like definitely you don't need a stitch that big. But then you can slide that onto your knitting needle really easily and then kind of tighten from behind, just a gentle amount. So there you've got your first stitch. So that's our first loop up. If you can tell here, it's probably really hard because all this yarn looks like really similar, but this was a loop up. You can see it goes back down and then loops up right here. So this hole right here is going to be the next place we pick up a stitch. Now on the second one, oh my gosh, I just about lost it. On the second one, I always take both strands. So both, this is, I don't know if you can tell because it's real small. This is my working yarn and my end. I always grab both because I find that it really anchors this in so it doesn't slide all apart by the time you're finished. I don't think I pulled that through all the way. Okay, there we go. So I've got both ends there, pull it out a little extra. Try not to let my needle slip out. I can't tell you how often that happens. That's like the most infuriating part of this process. So let me tighten those back down a little bit. And there we go. We got our first 2 stitches. And you want to make sure you're always pulling from that like up facing loop shape, because then it will follow in line with all the rest of your up facing loops. Because what we're doing here is creating that next up facing loop. So for the next one, do the same thing. So we just went through this up facing loop. We're gonna skip past the down facing loop right here, and we're gonna come around to this hole right here is our next up facing loop. I'll put the front of my crochet hook through. This time, you only grab both the working and the end, or I'm sorry, the tail once, just to anchor it in that second stitch. So this time I'm just gonna grab my working yarn, loop it around there. It's really awkward because we've got too many needles going on. You're gonna pull it through a little extra just so you can really easily slip it on that needle. Make sure it's not twisted or anything. Tighten it from the back, and there we've got 3 stitches. And then you'll just keep going like that until you get to this area where it's just going straight up. It gets a little tricky there as well. So I've got one more that I need to grab. Let's see, there's my up facing, down facing. I'm gonna grab this one right here is my next up facing. So once you get to the edge, it can be a little tricky to make sure you're getting the right amount so that your tension's gonna be correct along your seam here. I just twisted that one too. So when you get to this edge, you just want to make sure that you are picking one up for each row, and you want to make sure you're staying in the same row, so you're just picking up each V on top of each other. If you're jumping around, it's going to make your seam look really messy. So my next up facing loop is right here, and I never let those like edge stitches stand as my out facing loop, because it always gets messy, and those are always looser than the rest of them, and it does not look cute in the end. So pull that on there and tighten. And so I'm stretching it out more than it actually will be, but it's going to end up kind of looking like that. Let me do a couple more and I'll show you what it looks like. It looks really good if you can stay in that same row going all the way up to the top and then around the shoulder. If you did kind of the Kitchener stitch or even the seam that I did, you should have like a similar row to follow along around the entire armhole, as long as you kind of matched up your stitches well, but you'll do that all the way around. So when you're finished, it should kind of look like this. This is what the kind of up the length of the sleeve looks like. It's using a really similar technique as what we use to seam together the neon striped sweaters sleeves, where you're just making sure you're getting stitch for stitch. So you're only adding one stitch where there is one stitch. If you're doubling up or stretching it too far, you're either going to have bunching or holes. So it's really being able to recognize where your stitches are and that you're only adding one per each stitch. So the sweater I haven't talked about at all this video is the green sweater I started right before I started filming this video, which you can see I've gotten a good amount done on, and I am loving how soft and like plush it is. If you've ever knit brioche, you know that it's pretty time consuming, because essentially every row that you knit is only half a row, because you're only knitting about half of the stitches each time. And so as much time as I put into this, I am still very far away from it becoming a sweater, unfortunately. I did want to kind of talk about my process in this and also share my inspiration, because I've been calling this my Kermit sweater, because this photo here actually is what inspired me to make this sweater. I know that it's so silly. Look how comfortable he looks. I cannot get over it. And as soon as I saw it, it felt like I want to knit a sweater like this. So that's where I got the idea, but I definitely underestimated how long brioche takes. So it is not going to be finished for this video like everything else. Well, I have, as per usual, kind of overestimated my ability to finish a project in a timely manner. If I'm being honest, have spent about 3 months filming this video and working on projects even longer than that. And I have gotten to a point where I need to wrap it up. I was editing the other day and realized I had 3 separate clips that I had filmed all in different months of explaining what a gauge swatch was. And it was at that point I realized that like this has gone on too long. So I am gonna wrap the video up here. I have not finished any of my sweaters, which is just such a disappointing, unsatisfactory ending. I know. My plan. I do have a plan going forward here. And this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, because I know a lot of just knitting channels do this, because knitting is such a long process. It is so hard to get like one cohesive video out of even just making one garment, unless like that is your full-time job. And I have a full-time job, plus I do this, and it's just, I don't have the time to finish a sweater in less than about a 3-month time period. Even if I'm just working on that sweater, it's just very time consuming, especially because most of the ones that I make are fingering weight, so it takes a long time. And because of that, I'm planning on making some podcast episodes for two reasons. First is what I stated, that it just takes me so long to make a video about just one project or a, beginning to end process video, things like that, that it, like I said, would be months and months until I posted. And also, I do feel very limited by, I know a lot of like how-to videos and things like this tend to be in like a 20 to 30 minute length, which I think this one's going to be longer than that anyways. But I feel kind of limited by that time constraint because that's kind of the expectation for videos like this, which obviously you can do whatever you want. But I know just people are not going to be likely to watch an hour-long video about what is generally regarded as a simple concept, even though it is so not a simple concept. But anyways, I feel that podcast episodes, though, generally it's more expected that they're going to be longer, in which case I feel like I could explain a lot more things in a lot more detail. And if I have many episodes running, I can explain many things over a longer period of time instead of trying to cram them all into this video. That is not to say that I'm not still planning on posting like process videos and things like that. I just feel like specifically with knitting, it is so time consuming. I just have no time. Not to mention that I'm making like tons of little side projects. I just finished like a commission that I did for somebody making winter hats. I'm working on a birthday present for someone in December. I'm working on knitting Christmas stockings. Like, I have so many things on the back burner that is not even included in this video, but it's something I could talk about in a podcast that I do think it's worth kind of turning down that direction. So like I said, I think this video accomplished what I wanted it to. It's showing you my process, and it's giving you kind of the tools to work off of. It's definitely not a step-by-step video and not something that you could follow specifically. It takes a lot of your own math and planning ahead of time, which is kind of the keys to this, but it's like the, give a man a fish you can eat for a day. Teach a man to fish you can eat for a lifetime. If I give you one step-by-step tutorial, I teach you how to knit a sweater. I dress you for a day, but if I teach you the process of making your own sweater patterns, I can dress you for a lifetime. There you go. So that is where I'm gonna leave it for today. Like I said, I'm sorry you didn't get to see any finished product. I'm still planning on having process videos, but it will probably be more focused on my sewing and things like that, because that is so much easier to get finished in a timely manner. So thanks so much for watching and being here, and I hope to see you back again here soon.